Let's get ready to rumble!
Welcome, everyone. So good evening, and welcome to the first NIPS debate.
Tonight,
which promises to be a classic in every sense of the word. The proposition for this debate, meaning the statement that's going to be debated, is the following. Interpretability is necessary in machine learning. So let's meet our debaters.
In the first corner, on the affirmative side of the debate, measuring in at a height of 5'7" and 200 pounds, Rich Caruana! Rich is a senior researcher at Microsoft Research. His current research focuses on learning for medical decision-making, transparent modeling, deep learning, and computational ecology.
His partner in this debate of the decade, weighing in with over 11,000 citations. Give it up for Patrice Simard! He's a distinguished engineer at Microsoft Research, as well as Deputy Managing Director at Microsoft Research and founder of the Computer-Human Interaction Learning Group. His current research is focused on making machine learning widely accessible for replicating tasks easily done by humans.
And in the second corner, on the negative side of the debate, you've heard him talk already today, the king of calibration, fearless scaler of softmax temperatures, Kilian Weinberger. Kilian is an associate professor in computer science at Cornell. His research focuses on learning under resource constraints, metric learning, machine learning, web search ranking, computer vision, and of course, deep learning.
And finally, you may never have heard of this person, but weighing in with an H index of 97 is Yann LeCun! He is Director of AI Research at Facebook and Silver Professor of Data Science, Computer Science, Neuroscience, and Electrical Engineering at New York University. His current interests include AI, machine learning, computer perception, mobile robotics, and computational neuroscience.
The format of the debate has been pre-approved by all the participants. The debate will start with 5-minute introductory statements from all teams. Then each team will take turns asking a member of the other team a question. The total length of time for each question is a maximum of 1 minute, and the answer takes a maximum of 3 minutes. We'll keep questions short and to the point. Finally, we'll end with a question from the moderators. Just to remind everyone, the proposition for the debate is that interpretability is necessary for machine learning. And for the proposition, we'll have Rich Caruana and Patrice Simard. Against the proposition, we'll have Kilian Weinberger and Yann LeCun. And we'll start with Rich Caruana.
Let the fun begin. Okay, I want to start off by saying that despite what you may have heard, I actually like deep learning. And I agree there are many settings where a deep model trained on enough data that exhibits enough accuracy on the test data is all you really need to go, and you don't need to be able to see what's inside that black box. However, there are other settings where that's a very risky thing to do, even if you've got what looks like superhuman accuracy on the test data. And I'm just going to give you one example of it. Now, some of you have probably heard of this example already, so I hope I don't bore too many of you. This is going to be this pneumonia risk prediction problem. So let me summarize something that we've learned with real medical data. Bad news, all of you have pneumonia. But good news, we've trained a very accurate neural net to distinguish between those of you who are high risk and need to be hospitalized and those of you who are low risk and be treated as outpatients. So now, unfortunately, we think this neural net has learned some bad things. And the reason why we think that is that a rule-based system that was trained on the same data learned some unusual things. One of them being that a history of asthma seems to lower your probability of death from pneumonia. So asthma is like good for you if you've got pneumonia. So now doctors assure us that that's not the case, that asthma is actually bad for you if you've got pneumonia, as I think many of you would expect. But it's a real pattern in the data. And the reason why it's a real pattern in the data is that asthmatics pay a lot of attention to how they're breathing, and they're already plugged into healthcare. And what happens is the asthmatics tend to notice the symptoms of pneumonia earlier. They call their doctor earlier, they get an appointment earlier, and they get treatment earlier. So getting rapid treatment is actually a really good thing if you've got an infection like pneumonia. So it turns out it is true that the asthmatics in the data set actually do have less chance of dying because they get to good care faster. Unfortunately, if we use the model to help decide who should be admitted to the hospital or who should get an early appointment at the doctor's office as opposed to come in next Thursday, or who should receive different kinds of treatment, we might end up hurting some asthmatics because we might not give them the sort of rapid, aggressive treatment that actually explains why they were low risk in the data set in the first place, and that can hurt them. Okay, so what's going on here? The problem, ultimately, I guess, is that we want to intervene in people's health care, and we want to do that without a causal model, right? So we're going to use good old standard correlation machine learning, supervised learning. We're going to learn something about patients' risk, and then we're going to try to use that risk as a way of making decisions about patient care. And as you all know, so we're not going to do the proper counterfactual thing. That's a really risky thing to do. But the truth is, it's what we're doing a lot in machine learning. We're often training our model and then using the predictions from that model to make some decision in the real world. And very rarely do we actually go through and collect exactly the right data to be able to properly assess whether the model will predict the right thing. And in fact, in this case, for the asthmatics, it's not even ethical to collect the right data. We're not allowed to send half of the asthmatics home to see if not giving them high quality care is good or bad for them, just to train a more accurate model. So we have to somehow live with the data we've got. So what's the fundamental problem here? Well, we could change the learning problem. You might think there are other solutions. We could predict the care the doctors give. It turns out none of those actually work, although I don't have time to talk about it. Surprisingly, the fundamental problem here is missing variables. So asthma is serving as a proxy for something you'd really like to know, which is time to care, time to treatment. So at least for asthmatics, what's happening is they're getting to care faster, and that's a really good thing for pneumonia patients. So the asthma is a nice proxy variable for time to care. Unfortunately, we can't measure time to care. We don't know when you came down with pneumonia. We don't know how rapidly the symptoms evolved in you as a patient, how quickly you noticed it. So even in principle, we can't really measure this time to care variable. So we're actually never going to have it. Like you can't just say, oh, go back, get that time to care variable, and then this problem will go away. We assume, by the way, if we could get it, it would go away. That is, if we knew the time to care of all the patients, then for all the patients who, say, came in within 2 days of onset of symptoms, then presumably it would turn out that the asthmatics really were higher risk, compared to other patients who also came in 2 days but didn't have asthma. Okay, so now you might think, well, can't we fix this asthma problem some other way? Now that you know about it, yes, there are lots of tricks for fixing this problem. The important thing is, though, you have to know about it. We can't find it in the neural net. The only reason why we know about this is because somebody trained a rule-based system that we could understand, and we read the rule, which was that asthma lowers risk. It turns out we now have this class of very interpretable models, which lets us see what's being learned from this data set. It turns out that having a history of heart disease and a history of chest pain is also good for you. And it's good for you for exactly the same reasons. Because if you've had a heart attack before and you're now feeling something funny in your breathing, you don't even waste an hour before you're in an ambulance or you get to the ER. Okay, so these sorts of problems are ubiquitous. They're happening in all the data sets that we look at, these sort of proxy effects. They're all over the place. We've actually seen several dozen problems like this in this data set that I don't have time to tell you about. And we now think that, you just won't know about these problems. You wouldn't have anticipated them in advance if you can't sort of open up your model and see what's happening. So we think interpretation is very, very important for these models, or else the model is just going to learn risky things. So, thanks.
All right. Interpretability
interpretability. So it's not that interpretability is completely useless, but it's not nearly as useful as you think. First of all, the vast majority of decisions made by automatic systems, there's so many of them, nobody actually wants to look at it. There are classifiers used absolutely every time you go to a website, every time you go to Facebook, to Google, you do a search. There's a model that's tailored for you, and it makes decisions about what to show you, all that stuff. And there's billions of those things going on every day, and there's just not enough brain cells on the planet to even think about interpretability of those things. There's just not enough time. That's the reason why we want automated decision systems, because we don't have enough brains to make those decisions, so it would be economically unfeasible. So the vast majority of decisions don't need interpretability, or if we had it, they would be essentially useless. Nobody would want to look at it. Now, there is a small number of domains where interpretability is not only useful but required, like legal decisions. Like the whole point of a legal decision is you write an opinion, so that's the whole thing is interpretability basically. And we concede for certain types of medical decisions. So that's the example that Rich was talking about. But let me tell you a story. Several years ago, I collaborated with a bunch of economists, and they were interested in building models to predict real estate prices, house prices. So we started working on this project. They had some data set for houses in the Los Angeles area, and we built two models. One that was very simple, based on essentially linear prediction of some kind, a local linear predictor, and that was simple enough that the economists could interpret it, and they could write a paper about it in an economics journal, and look at the coefficients and say, well, this variable is actually important to determine price and whatever, and draw conclusions from it. And then we built a second model that was this big neural net with some sort of latent variable system that computed the desirability of an area, and it was fairly sophisticated. It worked really well, much better than the first one. So the economists wrote their paper. They used the first model because it was useful to them, even though the prediction was not so great. And then they turned around and they said, this thing kind of works kind of well. Maybe we could do a startup and predict the price of houses, and we could sell this to banks, to figure out the probability that someone will default on their mortgage. And say, okay, now, which one do you want? The one that's explainable or the one that actually works? And of course, they want the one that actually works. Every single time that I've talked to people who wanted to use a machine learning system, and they look at you in the eye and they say, it's very important that there is an explanation that's produced for every decision that's made by the system. It's super important. We're not interested in you producing anything unless producing an explanation. And then you show them two systems. One that has an explanation that's kind of simple, it's a generalized linear model, that kind of works but not so well, and another one that's a little more complicated, that works better. Every single time they'll take the second one. Every single time. Which means they don't actually care about explainability, it's just a way for them to be reassured. And most people, when you show them the data, are more reassured by an ROC curve than by an assurance that there is an explanation for what bad decisions the system makes. Now, we deal with this every day. The FDA deals with this every day when you get a test for, let's say, Lyme disease. The test for Lyme disease has an ROC curve or precision recall or whatever it is that they call it in medicine. And it's awful. It's terrible. The error rate is atrocious. We still use it. That's the only thing we have. So, until the 1970s, we had no idea how aspirin worked. People still took aspirin. Now we have a better understanding of it. But, there's a lot of things like this that, we don't quite understand the action mechanism of medicines. We still use them. So, explanations are not that useful. If you can prove that the system works in the real condition, there is sufficient kind of testing mechanisms that show you that it works in the condition it's supposed to work in. So there are other ways to test the validity of the system than explanation, and very often we are hypnotized by the fact that we want explanation because it reassures us, but in fact, factually, it doesn't mean that the system is better because it's explainable. Now, the last point I want to make is that this whole story that neural nets are black boxes, no, they're not. You can look at all the variables in them. You can do sensitivity analysis. What you want is, even if you use a gigantic neural net to make a decision about whether you want to give someone a loan or not, You don't want to produce an explanation of the type, oh, this coefficient is large, so blah, okay? The explanation you want to give people is, if your income was $75 per month higher, then, you would have passed the test, you would have gotten the loan, or, something of this type, or if your credit score was a little higher, you would, by that much, right? I mean, you can do this sensitivity analysis by gradient descending input space with any differential model you have. It doesn't matter if it's a gigantic neural net or a linear system. You can do it in all cases. So those things are not black boxes, right? We can completely investigate how they work. Thanks.
All right, so I should also confess that I'm a deep neural net guy, an old deep learning guy. But today I'm talking about interpretability. I'm going to defend interpretability. So, well, let's define it, because otherwise we don't know what we're talking about. And I'm going to define it through talking about a function. And the goal of machine learning is to find a good function among an ocean of bad function. And let's call the ocean of bad function the hypothesis space. And the problem is that in many cases, including most of the application of deep learning, we feel like the hypothesis space is fixed. And that's a problem because the hypothesis space can be very, very large. So let me give you a simple example. Imagine the task is to given a scenario, write a fiction book. And that's a very large space. And even if we don't start from a pixel or character, we just start from words. And we take a room like this and we put on this side positive examples of plotline books, and on this side we put just gibberish, and we put a 2-year-old or your best learning algorithm, and we decide to wait. And we know it's not going to work. And we can grow more brain cells, and we can add more GPU and more data, and it's still not going to work. And yet, probably everyone in this room can do it. So why? Why is it that it's actually not that hard a function to learn, and everyone here can do it? And I'm going to argue is because we grow the hypothesis space gradually. So we learn about words, we learn about sentence, we learn about style, we learn about metaphor, we learn about how to create characters. And this gradual growth of the hypothesis space, or this, I'm going to call it structural interpretability. This ability to break down the problem into a smaller problem makes life much easier when it comes to learning. Now, is this new? Well, in some sort it is, because if we look back 30 years ago, we had the famous failure of the expert system with all these rules. And I'm going to argue that this was because all these rules, they define the hypothesis space, and it was flat. And because of that, we couldn't debug it. It was so complex, there was an explosion number of rules, and there was just no way to fix it. And I'm going to say that deep learning has a little bit that symptom right now. It's flat, it's inexplicable, we just throw a lot of data at it. If we have a lot of data, that works well. But if we don't have a lot of data, then it becomes more complex. And the thing is that it's not completely flat because we keep cheating. So from year to year, at every NIPS, we add the radio, we add convolution, we add some regularizer, and we keep basically changing the hypothesis space. And this progress, we document them in NIPS paper. And whoever doesn't care about interpretability should stop coming to NIPS for the interpretability of the latest change in the hypothesis space. So we could argue that we do care at least a little bit about interpretability, so we can document the evolution of the hypothesis space, which basically makes life easier. So basically what I'm talking about here is what I call decomposition or structural interpretability. I think it makes learning a lot easier. I think it's a very good thing to do. It's also called modularity, and I'm sure we all agree that modularity is a good thing. And I think if we want to tackle some very complex problem, that kind of interpretability is necessary. Thank you.
Hello. So I want to argue that I'm of course with Yann, that interpretability is important in very, very rare cases. These are extremely rare and often appear kind of as a motivation in some papers on interpretability. In the real world, very, very often you do not need it. And one thing that you have to remember is you guys are all using things that are really, really complicated. For example, there's not a single person on this planet who understands how an i7 core Intel chip works. Right? It has so many transistors that nobody has any idea how it works. There's different teams that understand different parts, right? But nobody understands the whole thing. And yet, each one in this room is totally comfortable with using it every single day, right? Of course, you can argue, there's levels of abstraction, so you could say, here's an ALU and here's a memory chip, etc. But, you're actually not doing this, right? Ultimately, you're not really thinking about how your computer chip works, you just use it, and it works. And that's exactly what will happen with machine learning, right? Machine learning becomes more and more commonplace, and in those places where it works, it just works. There's various reasons why people ask for interpretability, and one of them is, understanding data. Right? So if you're a neuroscientist, you run a machine learning algorithm, at the end, you're really not interested in the prediction, you're interested in why it makes a certain prediction. That's a very valid claim. But that's really, what is that? That's a sensitivity analysis, right? What you want to know is which feature, had what input, had what effect on the output. So you don't really have to have a very interpretable method, right? We've been doing that for years, and people in neuroscience and biology have been doing this for a long time. I wouldn't call that interpretability. Another thing is machine learning debugging. People want interpretable machines such that, something goes wrong, you can fix it. But that's not really how people fix machine learning algorithms, is it, right? You don't really think about, what does every single weight in your neural network do, right? Instead, actually, you train, you change the way you're training it, etc. You collect more data, you clean your data, and so on. Another one is accountability. For example, an accident happens with a self-driving car, who is accountable for it? But again, the law doesn't really work that way, right? So another, a similar case actually is immunization. Immunization goes wrong occasionally, but you don't then investigate why exactly it went wrong, right? It's just something that happens statistically very rarely, and you have to have some legal framework that incorporates this. But finally, the most common reason, I think, why people want interpretability, especially when you're non-experts, is trust. Right? People are just scared of machines. And that reminds me of the 80s. I remember the time when I read this in the newspaper. This was like when I just learned to read, I guess. And for the first time, women became pilots. I grew up in Germany, so at the time, only men were pilots. And people got off the plane because a woman was a pilot. And they were like, we're all for emancipation, but that's going too far, right? And that seems crazy now. In hindsight, when you think about it, why do people have a problem with women being pilots? It makes no sense. But basically, people were just scared because it was something they weren't used to, right? And as ridiculous as that seems now, looking back on it, I believe that in 30 years, it's going to be crazy that people are scared of self-driving cars. And the reason is because it's going to be much, much safer than people driving cars. In fact, in 30 years, people won't be able to believe that humans once drove cars, right? Which seems ridiculously scary. If I still have a few minutes, I could do a little experiment. Let's do an experiment. I have 1 minute. Awesome. I want to do an experiment, a poll with the audience. So, please participate. So imagine, right, it's a sad story, sorry to tell you this. You have a horrible heart disease, and you need heart surgery. Okay? Luckily, there's a procedure against this, and you can go to the doctor now, and there's surgery. Unfortunately, it's pretty dangerous, so there's a 10% mortality rate. All right, so just picture this, 10% mortality rate. So that's if a human surgeon does it. There's, however, also a machine that just came out by some company. It's proprietary. You have no idea how it does now, how it works, but it has only a 1% mortality rate. Right, so 99% of the time, it works great. The difference is when the human makes a mistake, right, accidentally cuts the wrong artery and you die, afterwards, he or she can explain very clearly, I cut the wrong artery, right, really sorry about it. Whereas the machine, you have no idea, right, just some programming. Now I'm asking you, think about your family and your loved ones, And I'm asking you now, which one of you would pick the human surgeon? Raise your hand. All right, some of you brave ones. Which one would pick the robot surgeon? All right, thank you. Point taken.
So now we're going to have each team ask a question of the other team. And so we're going to start with the affirmative team gets to ask a question to the negative team. Once they respond, then the negative team will have a chance to ask a question, and so on and so forth.
Let's see, I certainly agree that if you've done adequate testing of this robotic surgeon, and in the real world it has only a 1% error rate compared to 10% for you, absolutely agree that's the surgeon I would choose. The problem is, in the pneumonia example, the model was actually rewarded with high accuracy on the test set for predicting that asthmatics with heart disease and chest pain were low risk. The model really has false high accuracy. And the only way you detect it has the wrong high accuracy for our intended use is to deploy it, kill people, detect that you've killed people, and then pull the model back and try to figure out what's wrong and fix it. However, if you've got something intelligible or interpretable, you have a chance of finding at least some of these problems before you go ahead and deploy the model and kill people. I mean, I don't know what they did to the surgical model before they deployed it, right? It's really hard to get a test set that is actually representative of what's happening in the wild. This is the fundamental problem. And what we've basically seen is that you just can't trust performance on a test set in many domains, especially when your intended use of the model is something that's sort of causal or counterfactual. You didn't evaluate the model that way when you trained it, perhaps, so now you really have to do something different. And we just find that every time we put on these magic glasses where we can see what's inside the model, we find an amazing number of things that are wonderful, beautiful, that do really make the model high accuracy. But we also see things that are very surprising, very disturbing, and that no human would ever let get deployed until they found a way to fix it. And it's just so important to be able to put on the magic glasses in many domains and see these things before you deploy. So I guess the question is, how do you counter that? I mean, in these domains, are you really going to just release the system and then see what happens? And then after you know it's good or not good, you'll decide whether to keep using it?
So I have extremely bad news for you. This is exactly how drugs are tested. The way drugs are tested is you actually try it, and hopefully you don't kill too many people. But that's exactly how it works. And you do it in phases, right? You start with chemical tests, and then you start with animals, and then it's drugs. Deep learning is drugs. No, that's a bad joke. It's a cheap shot. Yeah, maybe those like hallucinatory paintings that are generated. You can deploy it progressively on sort of increasingly larger populations, and you have A/B testing and things like this, and that's how everything is tested. Because ultimately, regardless of the fact that that you have an explanation or not, you cannot guarantee that your explanation is correct. Whereas testing is the only thing that guarantees that something is practical, correct, or helps people or helps cure them. And at some point, you have to test it, right? So. There are testing procedures to avoid killing people with drugs. Sometimes, tests for drugs are stopped early because they have bad side effects, or they actually kill people, or they're not deemed effective. Sometimes they're deemed so effective that also the tests are stopped because it becomes unethical to not give the medicine to the bee population. So, I mean, there are procedures that have been developed over decades for this kind of thing, and I don't see why it would be different for AI system than it is for drugs or for any kind of systems that we test thoroughly. We might have proofs of correctness for the software that we put in airplanes, using formal methods and stuff, but ultimately there is years of testing on the airplanes. And there's lots of fixes that take place while there is a testing period. That's the only way you can guarantee the system works. Now, if your testing procedure doesn't detect bad behavior, that means your testing procedure sucks, and you have to change it. That means your data set is biased. That means it's not general enough, and you kind of have to make it better. So if the statement is there are bad ways to test the system, yeah, of course there are. You can always do it wrong.
Just a brief response. I guess the issue here is we're not allowed to do the randomized clinical trial that you're thinking of for patients like asthmatics and heart disease patients, for which we actually already know the science reasonably well and know that delaying or withholding care would be bad for these patients. So I completely agree with you that for, let's say, future signals, future medical tests, things which maybe no human really fully understands, but which perhaps a deep model looking at raw signals actually can understand, that then you do have to go through exactly what you're describing, which is you have to train the model as best you can, evaluate as best you can, and then do a sort of careful rolled-out testing. I have no problem whatsoever with that. But there are a huge number of problems for which it is completely unethical to sort of adopt that approach. And the bias problems I have, these proxy problems, they just exist in every medical data set I look at, which means we would never be able to even do that first testing and deployment or clinical trial in a lot of these situations of a deep model. Because the first one, we would discover it was killing asthmatics and heart disease patients, and all of a sudden they would just never run another trial.
So it seems to me the problem you've been describing is not necessarily one of interpretability of the model, but one of causal inference in your data. And I certainly have absolutely nothing against causal inference. I think a lot more people should be working on causal inference than currently are. There is a lot of work in Facebook on this, and it's part of like perhaps a very core important thing in AI to be able to establish causal relationships. So that's super important, but it's explaining the data. It's not explaining the decision of a model. It's actually explaining the dependencies in your data. That's important, I think, at that level.
Can we now have a question from the negative side towards the positive side?
Okay, I want to say something. So, when we talk about machine learning, in many cases, we talk about learning from data. And unfortunately, it's very often restricted to learning from tables and examples. And in some way, it's one of the dumbest ways to communicate learning. You need a lot of data, and you need a very long enumeration, and then the magic of deep learning will solve the problem if you have infinite amount of data. Now, there are many other ways to communicate. Features is one of them, and I totally agree that you can have. I actually don't care about what's inside the box. So the black box things, absolutely, I have no problem with this. But I love it when the black box takes other black boxes input, and I can actually train those black boxes and basically get some guarantees. And now the higher black box is no longer a big black box because it has smaller black box that I can explain and I can keep decomposing. And that decomposition is a language, is a way I can teach, and it's far more effective than the one bit that a label can provide. Imagine you want to learn algebra, and you go to a class that teaches algebra, and you find out that your teacher can only give you yes or no answer on questions that you decide to ask. And is that effective? No, that's not very effective. There are much better ways to communicate knowledge, and they just happen to be interpretable because it's about asking the right question. I mean, this is what Socrates was doing. He was asking the right question as a way of explanation.
So I actually have a question. So any of the arguments you've used during your first 5 minutes or since then, can any of those be interpreted or construed as to be an argument in favor of, say, generalized linear models or trees versus, say, neural nets?
If you don't have either a model class that's very accurate and completely interpretable, or techniques for taking something that's much more complex. Like
hang on. So you mean one of those things that I listed is non-interpretable and some of them are?
So, a complex ensemble of trees is not very interpretable. Yeah. So you need, I think, at least one of two things. One is either a model that is itself very accurate, so that you're happy to use it, but is also very interpretable, and maybe they don't exist in some domains. I don't think such a thing exists yet in pixels or raw speech signals or places where deep neural nets are king of the hill. I don't think we have anything that can touch it that way. Or you need techniques that can take a black box model, maybe a deep neural net, and then help you try to understand what's in it, open up the black box a bit. I think you need one of those two things. And I'm certainly not in any way suggesting, oh, we should stop working with neural nets or anything like that. I mean, they're great. Where they work really well, they work incredibly well right now. But I think looking inside to find these surprising things that I now realize are sort of landmines scattered throughout almost every data set I look at, is just very, very important, because they would surprise you. Like if I gave you the magic glasses and you could actually see everything that was going on inside your neural net in some way, you'd be very happy with a lot of it, because it's really doing a lot of clever things. You might actually learn some things from it, which would of course be very nice. But you would find there's a surprising number of things that would scare you. And some of them are so obvious once you see them. It's like, oh, of course, I just sort of realized I was going to do that in the first place. And you can't just sort of say, oh, well, then you have to jump to causality, because even the causality, we're not allowed to do the right causal experiments to collect data on the asthmatics and heart disease patients. It's just not ethical to do this anymore. We have to adopt, perhaps like Patrice's argument, sort of training procedures that are somewhat different than just a massive amount of data, right? We don't train doctors by just giving them a massive amount of data. They actually learn chemistry, physics. They know what humans are, and then you start teaching them medicine, and then you give them practice. We don't give them like 100 million patients who lived or died and say, oh, just figure it out. We actually teach them a tremendous amount of other stuff. And because of that, they have all sorts of context and background information that prevents them from making what are very silly mistakes. I mean, everyone in the room frowns when you say asthma is good for you if you have pneumonia. But the neural net I trained didn't frown when it learned that asthma was good for you. It was happy to use it and was in fact well rewarded on the test set for doing it.
Yeah, I mean, AI doesn't have common sense yet, that's for sure.
One thing I want to say, and when you're saying, we shouldn't just train on a lot of data, but that's exactly what these machine learning algorithms are good at. And that's the one thing, that works really successfully, right? I mean, if you think about the machine learning landscape, right? Like what's been so, successful in the last couple of years, what has, created all these attention that we got is supervised learning, right? Because it works really, really well. And what is it? It's just to give it a ton of training data, and it finds basically patterns, to predict the label. And that's really all it does. I think the problem is that people think there's more going on than that, right? So that people kind of, give that, somehow humanize these classifiers, etc., and therefore expect there's, somehow they want to understand more than there is. And it's just patterns in the data, right? So one question I have for you is, what algorithms do you think are interpretable right now? I know you don't think deep nets are, but what makes the list?
Boy, that's a tough one. I think there are techniques for trying to open up deep nets, and we now are using some models that are pretty interpretable, like these fairly complex generalized additive models, where we actually train them to mimic the deep net, and then we look at what this model learns when it's a fairly good mimic of the deep net to try to understand it. Once again, though, this would not work at all in pixel space or raw speech space or places like that. This would work in places where the features have human meaning, and you could understand what the explanation might mean. There are a number of other techniques. So there are people in the room who are developing very specific kinds of tree-based, rule-based systems that are the inductive bias is specifically designed so that actually doctors can understand and things like that. So there are some techniques, but I don't want to make it sound like we're anywhere near as far along the interpretability front as we are along the supervised learning, deep learning front. An interesting thing, though, is deep learning models are, to me, they're sort of idiot savants. They're incredibly, breathtakingly good at some things, and yet they make really simple mistakes, right? You can take an image of a cat, cleverly manipulate just a few pixels. It still doesn't even look like the image has changed as far as I'm concerned. It still looks like a cat, but you can do this in such a way that the model suddenly thinks it's with high confidence a dog. Or you can take random bit patterns that look like random bit patterns to me, edit some of the pixels in such a way that it's now very confident that it's a dog, even though it still looks like a random bit pattern to me. Or there's the example in the talk earlier today of the system not recognizing cows on the beach, even though it's very accurate at recognizing cows in general. So these deep models, you know, they're amazingly good in some ways, and yet they're remarkably non-human in some of the errors that they make. And this makes me think that, at least in certain domains, it's important for us to go that extra mile to try to understand what they've learned. Because they don't have that simple bias that we have, that, like, it's pretty obvious asthma and heart disease just aren't good for you. They just don't know that, and they'll happily make mistakes along these fronts. And we just see this sort of time and time again in either bias, recidivism, fairness and transparency kind of data, or we see it in medical data. So it's just sort of ubiquitous that these things are doing something sometimes incredibly smart. You can't necessarily trust the accuracy on the first test set to really be an indicator of the performance in the wild. And it would be really nice to just sort of have some attempts at opening them up to understand not even the individual predictions they make, but maybe just understand the model as a whole so that you can kind of vet it or trust it.
So here's perhaps why this argument is wrong. There's a very recent paper by our friends at DeepMind on AlphaGo Zero, and then more recently they applied a very similar system to chess, and the system was essentially able to play at a very high level in just a few hours of training, of course, on a lot of machines in parallel. That system has plays in ways that are very, very strange for a human player. It doesn't know about the value of a particular piece, and it plays in very unconventional ways that grandmasters find surprising, but still get beaten. So that system would beat you every single time, and it has no idea of the concept that every expert playing chess has. And so that kind of is an example, and I'm not saying, because we didn't solve chess, we solve medicine, right? But obviously, I don't. But what it suggests is that the kind of explanation for particular types of moves that we would provide for chess just apply to our minds, but don't apply to actually a system that can beat us, right? So we can have systems that are more accurate, make lower error, and they're testable in testable ways. That will systematically beat us and be better than us, and they don't have the same kind of intermediate concepts that we have, explanations for why they work, or even the same strategies. They still work better.
Well, so that works really well when you have infinite amount of data, and the chess case is infinite amount of data. If you
do the big critic of this.
But there are not that many problems that have infinite amount of data. I mean, the problems that have a fixed distribution, like images or speech or genome or proteins, well, we keep accumulating every year another million or 2 million or 10 million label point.
Actually, images were more data than what we can deal with. We can basically build an entire image net in a day.
But sorry.
A lot of our companies, including yours, with the resources we have, we can build a new image net every day.
Yeah, but this, who cares?
It's essentially an infinite amount of data.
Yes, I agree. It's an infinite amount of data, but there are not that many problems. Can you cite 50 problems that have an infinite amount of data?
Actually, yeah, just about 50.
All right. How about the other problems?
No, I mean, there is clearly a lot of important problems where we don't have nearly as much data. I've been huge advocates of actually trying to develop methods that would allow machines to run with a very limited amount of data by learning unsupervised and acquiring some sort of common sense and learning representations of the world, etc. So I don't want to make the opposite argument here, certainly. And there's a lot of really, really important problems. I mean, there are situations like driving cars. You certainly don't want. We seem to have the ability to learn to drive a car without actually crashing. Most of us don't crash too much. I mean, there's a higher probability of crashing the first few years you're a driver, but you mostly learn to drive without crashing. If you use one of the current reinforcement learning systems that are used for playing Atari or Go or whatever, to learn to drive a car, hopefully through a simulator, the system will have to run off a cliff about 50,000 times before it figures out that it's a bad idea to run off a cliff. And then, run off a cliff another 50,000 times to figure out how to not run off a cliff. So that clearly is not as efficient as the kind of learning we do, and we certainly have to find methods for that. And perhaps what will come as a consequence of those kind of methods is, perhaps some level of background knowledge about the world and common sense that may solve some of the problems that Rich was talking about earlier.
I have a question. So imagine that, well, let me just tell you a story that happens all the time. A model is built in a company, in a big company, and at some point someone discovered the model doesn't perform up to spec. And the spec may be statistical, and so we can actually detect it. And then we go talk to the person, and we find out that person has been hired by Yann, and now we don't have that person. And now what do we do? Well, we look at the model and we don't understand anything that's going on in there. We don't know how the data was collected. We don't know how the feature were created. And that's a good case. The bad case is that the model stopped working up to spec, and we don't know the spec, and we don't discover that the model is working. And all the models that depend on it are now broken. And in programming, we have standards. When you do a check-in, you check in everything, and you know that the model is consistent. We don't have yet that kind of discipline for machine learning. We don't have a check-in that checks the data, the features, and the code that basically works together, plus the regularizer and all that stuff. And we don't have a check-in that forces you to give a name to basically what happened with the submodel that you have. So the question is, what is the discipline that we need basically to control the semantic of machine learning so that we can interchange the teachers and we can have continuity and maintainability across multiple people when, if we don't have at least some explanation of what's going on.
Let me, I don't know, what you're describing, I totally agree that's a problem, but I don't think that's a problem of interpretability. That's just of discipline, as you said. Of course, if you work at a company, I used to work at a company, and I had to deal with other people's code who had left to Google, Google. And I had to go through that spaghetti code and make sense of it. And that's, ultimately had nothing to do with, it wasn't machine learning or anything, right? It was just basically that people didn't have these standards, I guess, at that time, or, that you were forced to comment your code, etc. So, that you do that for machine learning algorithms, sure, I think that makes a lot of sense that companies should enforce this, but it doesn't have, the machine algorithm doesn't have to be interpretable, right? As long as you describe exactly what model it is you trained, and what the data was you trained it on, and what the hyperparameters were. I mean, we face that all the time in our papers, right? We release our code, and some people are better than others, so we try to make our results reproducible. And I think, it works if you are just conscious of the fact that, you have to be careful and make it easy for others, and include all the details, but then it's totally doable.
Yeah, I think, this is taking us perhaps a little outside of the original topic, but I get confronted very often with people who come to, the idea of using machine learning with the state of mind of sort of classical computer science. So computer science has this kind of slightly obsessive-compulsive aspect where, you write a program and every single detail has to be exactly correct or your program will just not function. And if it does function, you can prove it functions correctly. You can have convergence bounds and things like that. And that's the kind of exact obsessive-compulsive side of computer science, the kind of discrete math side of things. But then all of what we do with machine learning is solving unsolvable problems approximately. And so we're never going to get 100% correct. And now the approach is more akin to what people do in medicine or certain areas of engineering, where engineers invented things like ROC curves. And an ROC curve is a way to determine like how well the system will work, what the trade-off you're going to choose between detecting things, detecting things that are not of the type that you want to detect, or missing things that are of the type you want to detect, and that's what an ROC curve is. It was not invented by machine learning people. It was invented by radar operators, essentially. So we kind of have to be more flexible with our criteria, and we have to define some new methodologies, as you are referring to, certainly for assessing or ensuring the reliability of the system we deploy.
Okay, we'd like to thank the debaters and finish with a question. Say something nice about
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Very quick.
Okay.
Imagine you have two learning methods. Both of them have a 5% error rate on test data, and one of them is sort of interpretable, and a human expert, say a doctor, has looked inside and sort of vetted it. And then the other one is a black box, perhaps a deep neural net that we don't understand yet. Which one would you prefer? I mean, would you prefer the interpretable model, or would you just trust that 5% is 5% is 5%, and you don't really care for deploying a model?
So you can just say, earlier I asked which methods are interpretable, and you said decision trees. There's a huge gap, right? What did you say?
No. I mean, most
I heard
decision
decision
trees.
trees.
No. There's a form of generalized additive model that's reasonably accurate.
Somewhere was also a decision tree, no?
No. No, sorry. But go ahead.
But I'm saying, of course, you can have it all, sure, right? But you cannot, and I think the gap right now is, still pretty large between, people train these much simpler models, right, that they believe are interpretable, ultimately the point that Yann made and that, I also tried to make was, if there's a gap between a very accurate model that's not interpretable and one that's a lot worse but is interpretable, everybody picks the better one.
Assuming they
All
trust.
things being equal, sure, why not?
Assuming they trust the test data, of course.
Yes.
I completely agree. But while there might be a gap now on many problems, there are many problems for which there isn't a gap right now. And with further, you seem to agree that if you could have interpretability and accuracy at the same time, of course. So that sort of suggests, well, it's important we should work on it.
It's a big if.
Yeah, maybe it is a big if. But I think for many problems, it's probably achievable. Or at least a way of opening up the black box models and understanding.
All right, so to conclude the debate, we'd like to ask each of you to describe what you think the best argument is for the other side. We'll start with Rich.
It's a great question, by the way. So there's no doubt that if you can get significantly higher accuracy on test data that you trust, that doesn't have the kind of problems that we're seeing in test data where you're actually rewarded for doing the wrong things, there's no doubt whatsoever that if you can get higher accuracy, I would, as you're suggesting, would always go with the black box model over the interpretable model. I guess if I was a scientist who's more interested in trying to advance my field of endeavor and understanding, then perhaps I would prefer a more interpretable model for other reasons, to make advances. But in a purely predictive situation where you've got a model that you completely trust is more accurate, you'd be just sort of crazy to not use the more accurate model unless there was some huge advantage to having the explanation interpretable.
So let me give it a crack. So it's clear, and I'm going to, kind of make an argument that justifies some of the stuff I'm working on, but it's still an argument, from the other side. There are stupid mistakes that you describe, like the asthma. You can detect them as mistakes, or not mistakes of the model, but probably bias in the data, because of common sense, because of common knowledge, some extraneous knowledge that you have about how the world works that makes you be very suspicious that asthma makes you more healthy in some way. So that kind of forces you to investigate. And so the argument there is that machines are going to make stupid mistakes until they have the same kind of background knowledge that we have, until they get common sense. And so that could be an argument for being careful and being more thorough in the testing, I guess. And let's be careful. Let's have very careful methods for testing, because machines don't have common sense. We can't rely on their background knowledge to kind of catch stupid mistakes of this type.
All right, so since I used to be a deep learning guy, it's pretty, well, okay, I'm still so I remember there was a time where
someone should remind people, this is the first guy who actually trained the convolutional net on GPUs.
Yann was my intern, and he was the one who did it. And now he's a VP of engineering at NVIDIA. So what I was going to say is that I remember that when we were doing neural net a long time ago, and some people were skeptical, and I remember thinking, what's wrong with these guys? Because it was absolutely obvious to me that even if our model was not the best yet, we would keep adding data and retrain, and it will eventually win. And so I didn't understand why people did not embrace neural nets at the time, because it seemed like, how can you possibly lose? You just wait, there's a little bit more data, you increase the capacity, and eventually it works. Now, again, that works when you have a lot of data. And so if you have a lot of data, absolutely deep learning. And if you infer the knowledge from data, interpretability is, I would probably, it's overrated.
So one mistake that humans make is that humans always think like humans, and humans think that machines think like humans. So we humanize machines. And so when people see a neural network or a machine learning algorithm make decisions, we kind of have in our mind why it makes decisions the way it does. So let's say it classifies cows, then we assume, images of cows as cows. Well, we assume obviously it's because there's a big fat cow in the image, right? But it may just not be. It may just be because of something else. And that doesn't occur to us because we wouldn't think that way, right? But the data could very well be, and this is the example that I guess Rich gave early on, that every single cow image had green grass in the background, and every single car image had a street in the background. And all it does looks at the pixel in the bottom right corner. If that's green, and it's a cow, and if that's black, it's a car. And so that's ultimately the machine is not doing anything wrong, right? That's a clear pattern in the data set. And so it does, ultimately we asked it to make these predictions, and it does it right. It's just that when we see it, we assume that it works like a human. So interpretability helps us debug this in a way that we realize, no, machines can actually think actually shouldn't say think, can operate very, very differently from the ways that humans would make these decisions. And I think that's a strong argument why you need this, why you need interpretability.
Okay, great. Thank you all, and let's everyone give a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Thank you all for coming to our symposium.